the bumblebees working down in the dandelions, and you're frustrated by that because here's you got this perfect pear tree in bloom, and it should be happening, but they're not up there. If you're patient, you will see as the sugar levels rise in the pear, and the bumblebee satisfies its need for pollen, because that's part of creating a new brood. It's not just about nectar. The wild solitary pollinators need a lot of pollen. They need that pollen. It's not a question of getting rid of the dandelion. It's a question of waiting for sugar levels to rise in the pear. Another trick I've known people to do is to take a bunch of pear flowers from another tree and blenderize it into a slurry and put that into a spray to spray on the other pear tree, because you're spreading the pollen into those blossoms. So sometimes pears can be tricky to pollinate because of those low sugar levels. Yet there are tricks that help us get beyond that. But mostly I wanted to come down here because earlier today I was looking at these fruit trees on the back, and you might have seen them on the way on the back of... Oh, there it is. We have a tent caterpillar. There's not a lot of bug damage happening here yet, but one of the things at this time of year that I'm on the lookout for is chewing on the edges of buds. So the tent caterpillar represents one moth that they build that tent and they defoliate a branch. But the chewing on the buds, which I know I saw this morning, walking around down here, indicates a number of different leaf rollers. And often they will roll the edges of leaves together. And this is kind of the launching point of pest management in the orchard season. So I'm not seeing it right now, but we'll find it. When I see a lot of that, I know that these are all surface feeders. So when I'm talking about something like the red-banded leaf roller, do I care that the majority of the buds on my tree are being nipped and folded? And I know new leaves grow, and that doesn't seem really important. But with moths in particular, there's a generational factor. And if the first round, the first generation, succeeds in their cycle, then by midsummer, there's a lot of second-generation moths whose larvae are the ones that are going to feed on the skin of the fruit. So it actually is quite relevant to my harvest because of that sequential step of the generations. And this is one of the key things you do in terms of insect pests. It begins with identifying that moth. Now here, I don't so much care is it a bleak-banded leaf roller, is it a red-banded leaf roller, is it a green pug moth, is it etc., etc. I know that it's a surface feeder by which it completes its cycle on the outside of the tree. It's eating the edges of leaves, so when I'm looking at buds and seeing a lot of chewing on the edges, we're starting to see leaves rolled over on themselves. One of the tools I have that works really well against this particular grouping of pests is Bacillus thuringiensis, the BT, the dipel spray. And that acts as a stomach protein poison specific to Lepidoptera larvae, caterpillars of moths. So when I make my pink spray, and I'm going to be talking in terms of bud stages, I include BT in that spray if I see a lot of damage on that. As things get pollinated and we start to have fruit, we come into the window when most of the damage to the fruit crop is done. And at petal fall, there are 3 insects that really get active. One is the plum Curculio, which is a small weevil about 3/16 of an inch in size. Another is the European apple Sawfly, which is actually out here right now helping to pollinate, but it's also leaving an egg behind in blossom clusters. And the other is the Codling moth. So let's look at some of the specifics of each one of those pests in terms of understanding its life cycle, because in its life cycle, we look for points of vulnerability. So the fact that something like plum Curculio has to get into the soil to pupate, that's a point of vulnerability because there's something I can do to impact those population numbers. And it's only through understanding it that I can see where those points are. And there are some things we can do mechanically or physically to limit that. There's also some spray materials we can reach for if things get more out of hand. And when we reach for those spray materials, it's really important that we know how they work. So the business of the clay with the neem oil, that not being effective, it's because clay, kaolin clay, works because it's been refined to a really small particle size, and those particles come off on the insect. And if they don't flake off readily, they're stuck to the tree, then they don't work because they're no longer coming off and irritating the insect. So as a way of even understanding that better, I am 6'3", and now in the blink of an eye I'm going to shrink to 3/16 of an inch in size. I am now a plum Curculio. I have warts on the back of my head and I have kind of a snout-like nose. And I'm crawling through your fruit trees.
Before we go much further, you guys feel free to get closer. This sounds exciting. You know, we can get closer. Yeah, come on in.
It's an organic amphitheater. I hope I can match the excitement level now. So, one of my habits, what a Curculio does, is it overwinters in the woods. So it does that because usually in an orchard setting, the leaf litter, we're working to decompose it as I described earlier, but often it's wind blown. And it isn't until you get deeper along into the woods itself that it has dependable leaf litter. So it has learned as a species that it has better odds of overwintering if it goes there where it can have protection. And not atypically, when you look at an orchard site, if there are hardwoods to the southwest, then that is where Curculio will probably go, because it's going to be in August, early September, when it's leaving the orchard to seek a wintering place. And hardwoods are going to have leaf litter, conifers are not. And southwest is where the setting sun kind of draws their attention. Now, that doesn't mean that they've read the right book and understand that. Some sites are going to come from the north or the southeast or what have you. But typically, if there's hardwoods to the southwest, I know that the next spring, that is probably where they're going to come from. So again, that's kind of a point of vulnerability. So this insect does not instantly appear, but it only comes once it gets warm enough. So some years it's warm enough that it will be out in the fruit trees before bloom. Other years it may not show up for a week after fruit has set. So that makes it a little bit trickier to understand. You know, when I say to apply the clay spray the week of petal fall, that's just a good average guess. It doesn't mean that maybe that particular cool year you could have waited 2 more weeks until they really came. But once there's fruit forming on the trees, that's when they have the opportunity to do damage. So earlier, there's no reason to be concerned. Now, as you have a setting like this where all kinds of fruits are being grown, the plums are going to have fruit set and starting to show enough size before the apples do. And if you're constantly losing your plum crop to Curculio, then you have to spray that clay down here earlier than you necessarily do on apples that you want to protect. So which fruits you're growing ties into this, because they're quite willing to zoom in on plums. That's what they're named for. They're quite willing to do peaches, apples. They will do feeding stings, lay eggs, and pears, but that often results in the egg getting crushed because pears are really dense, so pears can take it a little bit. So here I am, a 3/16 inch Curculio, and I've come into your tree, and I have this habit of, during the day, a bird flies overhead, something that might eat me, I drop to the ground and play possum. So during the twilight hours, I'm often coming back up into the tree, and if it's really warm in the high 70s, I might fly up into that branch. If it's a little cooler, I might crawl up the trunk and out the branch. So there's a lot of crawling that takes place. So when kaolin clay, the surround clay, is sprayed, that's been refined to a particle size of 4 microns in size. So here I am, 3/16 of an inch tall. 4 microns in size is the right size to wedge into my armpit and go up my nostrils and get into my eyeballs and into my ears and into my reproductive parts. And so now, instead of wanting to, as a female, lay 3 to 4 eggs a night, and male and females alike feed on those fruit, I just want to groom, get rid of those sharp-edged, irritating particles, and ponder why you're the kind of being that would want to cover these fruit trees with this white clay powder. And so Curculio stops feeding and stops laying eggs. I've realized now that I brought you down into a black fly haven.
And yellow jacket.
Yellow jacket is your friend.
Yeah, I've
This
been
one's
stung
really
before.
pesty, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, he
This
does,
is an
It's the
agenda.
shirt color,
he
probably.
does seem a little pesty.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's your shirt color.
The relevance,
Probably.
I'm interrupting the plum Curculio part, but the relevance of that yellow jacket is, you know what it feeds its young all summer long?
What's that?
Caterpillar larvae. So it's out here gathering the bad pests.
He thinks you're a
What
caterpillar.
about the eastern?
It's hard to get into a tent caterpillar nest. But once they're out there, it might. But it doesn't really have brood yet. Anyway, plum Curculio. So now it's irritating. If there's nowhere for it to go, everything's been covered with white that it might want to have an interest in. It just waits you out. And so you might need to keep your fruit covered for 8 to 10 weeks before it's just exhausted and the cycle is over for it. The fruit's getting too big, it can't have the impact. On the other hand, if you leave a tree or 2 or 3 unsprayed in the immediate ecosystem of where you're trying to grow fruit, and that can be a deliberate tree like a Japanese plum on the southwest edge of your orchard, or something like a Liberty apple, which tends to be an apple variety that really attracts Curculio, or something like any of the really lush foliage edible crab apples like chestnut crab. And again, if you've identified there's an entry side, that would be the side you leave it. That unsprayed tree becomes a trap tree in that they are push and pulled to a place where they don't find the irritant. And they actually do. They show up all covered in white, and you can hear them just going, that idiot forgot to cover this one. And they come there in numbers. And in the early years, it means, yes, you're not necessarily getting fruit from that tree. There's obviously really going to be some pressure. But this is where, in understanding life cycle, there's a point of vulnerability. They have to get down into the soil. And so when you lay out carpet or tarps, plastic tarps, under that trap tree, somewhere to cover like 3 weeks in June, not that first week, but the last 3 weeks in June, you're going to create a little landing pad where all those falling fruitlets from which the larvae expect to crawl out to get into the soil cannot penetrate into the soil. And so the trap tree now becomes not just a sacrifice, but something that starts to have an impact on next year's amount of population that's going to be on your site. You know, trap trees can also be things like your neighbor's apple. It could be the wild trees in the sheep pasture. It depends on the distance. I mean, it can't be too far away. Wild trees have many virtues in terms of not necessarily causing you harm. It's really on the disease front. The fact that most people don't prune a wild tree and it becomes very dense, and so it doesn't dry out as readily after a rain. It becomes a greater source of scab inoculum because no one's working that particular tree. But if you prune a wild tree and it's more open and less likely to become a scab vector, then the fact that it works as a trap tree can be in your favor. You don't necessarily do the underground management there and knock back population numbers, but you get this idea. We have the ability to impact this insect. One of the things that's interesting about Curculio is for many, many years we had no idea where it went in the winter. And it was Quebec researchers, always Quebec researchers, who had the idea to put radioactive isotopes on the backs of little Curculios. And then they would track them with Geiger counters. And one of the places that they found really a hot spot were the toads, because toads eat a lot of Curculio. So creating like toad habitat now becomes part of your strategy. Those trap trees, another approach is that's where you bring in the chickens for those 2 weeks of fruit drop. You know, it's not like you can release the chickens all throughout the orchard and they're going to be covering every square inch equally, because chickens kind of do their own thing. But when you funnel the pest and you funnel something like the chicken to the right spot, that interaction can be really favorable. There was an orchard in Wisconsin, Turkey Hill, and they had 100 acres of apples, and they were getting all these spent egg layers and releasing them in their orchard. They had like 500 chickens patrolling the ground, and it wasn't too much longer that there was a couple dozen foxes who were picking up the patrolling chickens, and there weren't that many chickens, and it had no impact whatsoever on Curculio. Another thing about the surround kaolin clay. So I spoke to the need to flake off, why we don't apply it with an oil. Back in the 1920s and 30s, they were working with pottery grade kaolin clay. And I'm telling you this because sometimes people have the idea, hey, it would be a lot cheaper if I buy this pottery grade clay. That's not refined. And so that clay wasn't small enough to come off on the insect. And secondly, that clay was not unlike trees growing along a dirt road where the dust from the cars going by starts to accumulate on the tree, and the tree is actually blocked from sunlight because there's a barrier coverage on it. So rough grade kaolin limits the amount of photosynthesis can take place, where the small clay size, even though it looks totally white, allows sunlight to penetrate and bounce around between those small particle sizes. So when I apply the clay, typically we just say the week of petal fall. If it's a really cool season, I may delay that a week, and there's some nuance with this. If you're growing plums or peaches, you're going to want to get that coverage on before you do on the apple, before it comes out of the shuck split stage. That way you're not getting it on the soft fruit itself, but it's going to emerge out of that little covering. Ideally, that's going to be enough to nudge Curculio to the next thing, and if you've left the trap tree, that's where it's going to end up. In the beginning, I had no problem with Curculio on pears, so I didn't spray my pears. The first couple of years I used the kaolin, and I quickly recognized I started to have all kinds of damage on my pears, because those were my trap trees. You know, this is before I had started to think about trap trees. That was part of my process of understanding that. That first week you make that coverage, you're going to make your trees totally white. In that you're going to want to do 2, perhaps even 3, maybe 4 applications. And I give that range because it depends on the capacity of your sprayer. So you're going for, on a big scale rate, 50 pounds per acre. But to get there, in my sprayer, I do 25 pounds at a time, so I do it twice. And I like building up layers. If you have a backpack sprayer and you've been experiencing it clogging, you just have to lessen the rate and do it a couple more times to accommodate so you build up enough coverage. And that clay, after a rain, is going to appear to wash off. Things dry out, it'll come back. That's where people get into thinking, I need to stick it to the tree somehow, but that's not going to work that way. That same clay spray is also going to have some effect on codling moth. So codling moth, around the time of the end of bloom, the beginning of fruit set at petal fall time, has met the male. The female has found the male. They've mated, and the female is now coming to lay eggs wherever it senses fruit developing. And so usually it comes in from up high and alights in the top of the tree. And through its antenna and the pads in its feet, it feels the tactile surface of the apple, and that confirms, yes, I've got the right tree. Not only do I smell fruit, but it feels right. Well, the clay makes it very slippery. So our coverage of clay for Curculio is having an impact on codling moth landing. And maybe up to 50% of its egg laying is not going to happen as a result of clay coverage. And that's kind of neat to know as you start to think about how these things fit into place. Another pest in this same kind of triad moment is the European apple sawfly. So this is something that came here from Switzerland about 60 years ago. And it is about 3/8 of an inch long and has an orange underbelly. And so it is drawn to the ultraviolet light hue of a white apple blossom. And it goes into a blossom cluster, and each female lays 1 egg at the base of that cluster, and it also leaves behind a little chemical sign that says to all the other females, I've got this cluster covered. So that ability to tell the other females to go elsewhere makes it very effective at really spreading its eggs throughout a tree canopy. And this is a pest that likes to work its way from the outside in. So those branch tips, everything that's out there in the full sun, that's where you're going to grow your best fruit. You're going to have the highest levels of sugars. Here's a pest that's specializing in making sure there's an egg laid in each one of those blossom clusters. And that little larva, when it hatches, crawls across the skin of a fruit the size of a pea, and it's making a scratch to feed. And if it doesn't go on enter that fruit to eat the seeds, that fruit often grows to harvest. And that's where you see that winding russeted scar. It almost looks like a letter sometimes. If it looks like a recognizable letter, it's probably the initial of your one true love. So you can keep that in mind. But that's the kind of thing that you look for and learn. I have Sawfly. I now am aware I have Sawfly. So one of its points of vulnerability, so to speak, is the fact that it cues into the white radiation pattern given off by the apple blossom. So a white sticky card trap is hung at pink, and those white cards are of the same white hue as the apple blossom. And Sawfly will get stuck onto that card. So in the early years, when you start to have a Sawfly problem, I used to hang as many as 40 cards to an acre and catch like 60 Sawflies on a trap. That's not a measure that's going to ultimately keep it in check, but in the beginning, it's enough of a measure that it may not be so bad. But this is something that the numbers keep building. It pupates in the soil as well. And when the numbers get large enough, you're losing 20 to 30% of your crop because each and one of those larvae that makes that scratch goes on to eat the seeds of a second fruit and a third fruit and a fourth fruit. So every apple in a cluster can be lost to that one larva. That's an unusual thing in that larva goes on to the next fruit. When those numbers get really bad and trap cards alone are not enough to get it into a place where you're comfortable with, one of the things in our toolbox is something called spinosad. And spinosad is the fermentation byproduct of a particular soil organism that was found in the Caribbean. And those byproducts have a toxic effect on a lot of caterpillars and soft-bodied insects, and also sawfly, particularly sawfly when it goes from that first instar stage, it makes a scratch, to the second instar stage where it goes in to eat seeds. So in petal fall week, I will make this application of spinosad every year, every couple of years, if the numbers are building back up. And I can actually go into the tree and see those scratches and determine to my own sense that I think I need to do something about this. I like not to do that every year because I don't want to build up resistance of this pest to this particular material. Spinosad is something, as a commercial grower, I buy as a formulation called Entrust, and it costs like $600 a pound. It's pretty daunting, and you're using 2 ounces to an acre. As a home orchardist with a handful of trees, you can buy a diluted spinosad product, and that comes under names like Monterey Spray, or Uncle Jack's Deadeye Bug Spray, or Bullseye. And
I think they have that. I think that's in like flea and tick stuff for dogs and cats. But
it could be used for that.
so I think I've seen it on the label.
So it's actually one of our broader hitting organic insecticides. One I don't want to overuse, plus there's the price aspect to it. But when I do use it, it's something to knock it back so I have a year or two of something that's more tolerable in terms of damage. And it has to be applied during petal fall week. In Europe, they're using quassia, which is an herbal remedy from something that is harvested down in the tropics, and it's the wood chips of the quassia tree. But the rate is like 25 pounds of an acre. I have to figure this out where I could do this bulk herb thing, because that's a lot. But I'd like to do that because spinosad is Dow agroscience, and it's just not the realm I want to really support. On the other hand, and the other thing about spinosad, if you buy it, it has a 3-year shelf life. So it's definitely good for 2 years, and it should be good for the 3rd year if the product you bought is fresh from your supplier. But once you bought it, if you go to year 4, it's not going to have any impact at all. And that becomes relevant as you buy things, because there's some things you can buy in greater quantity and they're going to keep, like we were talking about BT at lunch, Bacillus thuringiensis. As a dry powder, I've used product that's as old as 7-8 years, and it's been effective. So that's something I know has a shelf life. When I buy liquid fish, we're going to get to talking about that. That's good for 2 years. But eventually it's going to start to break down and not have the oomph that it's meant to have. But that allows me, in my case, I buy it by the barrel. And I can buy, when I have it shipped in, you can fit up to 4 barrels on a pallet, which costs the same to ship it. So I buy 2 barrels because I need it for 2 years apart. So those kind of things can help you save money and figure out where does this fit in with what's going. And sometimes, with spinosad, it is something I keep in stock because of sawfly, and now also because of the spotted-winged Dropsophilia, which is the Japanese vinegar fly, which is going to be a major issue on things like raspberries and blueberries and stone fruits like apricots and cherries, any of the soft fruits. And the vinegar fly is different than our native fruit flies in that it goes after immature fruit. And every 8 days it has a repeat generation. And so it goes from a few blown in on the wind to 2-3 weeks later, and suddenly there's tens of thousands of flies coming off your raspberry bushes. And right now we don't really have particular solutions for it other than something like Trust. Pyganic works as well. That's a pyrethrum product.
It's not Japanese beetle, is it?
No,
What was the stuff they have, the herbal stuff in Europe?
Quassia.
Quassia, and it's not available here. It's not.
It's made as an extract in Europe, and you can buy the quasin, but here it's not available. And it's complicated here because as much as we're all into organics and the organic market seems to be building, percentage-wise, the share of the market for spray products of those who want organic is so little that a lot of times very sensible things are not done.
Sure.
Because it's just not going to be feasible.
And before we leave the Curculio story, as you as the 3/16, when you drop down onto the tarp underneath the trap tree, what do you do then? You're the Curculio. What happens?
I'm not an adult Curculio.
You're a baby Curculio.
I'm a little grub.
You're a tiny little guy.
And I don't have the energy to hike 10 feet because you did this to this ecosystem.
So you're just going to sit there and become...
You're going to shrivel up in the sun.
Thank you. I just needed to complete that one. Thanks. That's good.
Does diatomaceous earth have any use for orchard? You know, that you can pass down?
So diatomaceous earth, which is the shells of really small sea creatures, is... Here in the Plymouth area, Rumney area, you're not seeing brown marmorated stink bug in any great degree, are you?
Yeah, unless I brought him up from Pennsylvania, but I think I made sure.
Well, this Asian pest that came into Pennsylvania originally is becoming a big problem in the Mid-Atlantic. It's also in Michigan and the Great Lakes region. And stink bugs, the native stink bugs, there's a number of predators for, but brown marmorated stink bug can get into bigger numbers. So there's some analogies here that are relative to Japanese beetle. So when I'm talking about stink bug, some of the same kind of thinking would apply to Japanese beetle. So one of the things that I do with those kinds of ornery pests that are not native, really just coming in, and at first their populations are going to be much greater. With Japanese beetle, after about 5 years of suffering, you have to understand it will get better because certain parasites and tachinid wasps will catch up with it, but it's going to take several years of a lot of issues before some of the good things start to get that more in balance. Stink bug is very new to the scene. And
we don't have any wasps yet. There was one that they were talking about in Virginia, but I don't know if that...
There are some things they're releasing from Asia, and there's hope, but it's going to take time. So here's this pest that when it comes, it makes a feeding into the fruit and sucks out the fruit, and then it becomes a brown, corky spot. And if it's really bad, it can actually make peaches be cat-faced. They're all rugged and bumpy. This is an insect that has things it really likes. So this is a take on trap trees in a different way. In the case of something like stink bug, it's something like pumpkins or sunflowers or millet. And growing those crops means it has something it prefers, it might prefer. And if your fruit trees, which you're concerned about, one of the things you're doing is spraying the neem oil, which acts as a feeding deterrent. It makes them a little less attractive. That means they're more focused all the more on the trap crop. Like Japanese beetle has some real preferences, being like grape, or green beans, or red clover, or the Honeycrisp apple seems to be a real draw for Japanese beetle. So if you're dealing with that, kind of tune into the fact that you can create what will seem like sanctuaries, things that it likes. But these then become places where you can do much more radical things than you might do in your fruit trees. like using things like a flame weaver when when the pumpkin patch is all covered with brown marmorated stink bugs. And you're eliminating the pumpkin, but you're not eliminating all your fruit trees out here. Similarly, you might spray a pyrethrum product. So in our toolbox, there is pyganic. It also costs quite a bit, but this is a toxin, botanical toxin derived from the daisy. And this particular toxin only lasts about 3 to 4 hours before it breaks down in ultraviolet light. But it's very broad spectrum, so it kills many different things. I don't like to use it because I don't want to kill all those good guys that I've been trying to increase and improve. But I'm much more willing to use it on a sacrificial crop, knowing that I've drawn the insect pests to those places. And part of that is going to be, again, by making my crops a little less favorable. You know, like with trap trees. If I've decided this Japanese plum or this Liberty apple is my trap tree, I won't prune those trees until just before bloom, because by pruning late, it releases volatile odors that makes them that much more of a draw. Another thing that can be done with trap trees is to do a vinegar spray. It lowers the bricks of those trees. It makes it more attractive to pests. I do the pruning thing, I don't do the vinegar thing. But once you've identified points of entry and habits that seem to be there year after year, you'll be able to fine-tune, where do I put that trap tree? And then when you start working with some kind of underground, understory management technique, that's when you start to have an impact so that you have less for future years. And it really does make a difference. It really does get better. So another pest, and did I? Yes, I did. I don't have part of the crop here. But another pest that comes on the scene is the apple maggot fly. Oh no, wait, one other thing. So spray products list the pests that they control. And in the years where I spray spinosad for European apple sawfly, because I am trying to knock back its populations, spinosad actually has an impact on about up to 50% of the Curculio population. So that's not enough to put it on the label. That's not enough to say this is worth buying for this purpose. But if I am doing that application for Sawfly, in those years, I don't do the clay in the petal fall week because I don't need to. The spinosad is going to have some impact on that first round of population. I don't necessarily use that expensive product just because I might have Curculio, but I take advantage of the fact that I understand it has this dual dynamic. So in terms of you and neem oil, let me get a little more specific. I'm going to be talking about the holistic sprays for disease, and it's going to include the liquid fish and the neem oil. Both are fatty, and both would stick the clay particles. And I'm going to talk about how one application is made at petal fall. And when I say petal fall, like in an orchard, like one application, unless we have like an inch or more rain, one application a week for the next 2 to 3 weeks is going to work for what I'm doing. But this is a very tricky time because most of us here are dealing with the tail end of the fungal disease cycle, and we're also dealing with this petal fall triad, which when it really gets out of hand, you're going to lose 90 to 95% of your potential fruit. So it can be really, really bad in some places. We all don't have Curculio necessarily to the same intensity. How would you rate it down here, Kevin?
I've got plums, and they'll all fall off.
Right.
It's very present.
It hits my plums, but it doesn't hit my apples so much. I have a cousin.
If I ever get a thick crop of apples, I don't mind if they thin them out a little bit.
Right. If we were in Connecticut, Rhode Island, I would almost guarantee everyone would lose 95% of your crop to that one pest. But this combination of pests coming at the tail end of when fungal disease gets a hold, and let's think back to what I talked about, how the shoots have that kind of pause in their growth. This is also the phase where shoots start to regrow and there's young, tender leaf tissue. So a lot of the work of growing nice fruit is occurring in these 3 to 4 weeks, from bloom till about 2-3 weeks after. So codling moth, I did this last night, so some of you heard this, but this is also very helpful in terms of thinking about biodiversity. Codling moth is also not a native pest. That is pretty ubiquitous. And in this part of the world, we deal with 2 generations. And if we have a really, really hot summer, there might be 3 generations. In a place like California, they deal with 6 to 8 generations because it's warm enough for that moth to complete its cycle. So here we've identified a specific pest. It's an internal feeder. So this is totally different than what I was describing about surface feeders and how BT works really well. This is a larva that within 24 hours of hatching is inside the fruit. So that's like getting into home base. You're playing hide and go seek or tag, and you're safe once you're inside that fruit. Codling moth overwinters as a larva in diapause, and the relevance of that is it kind of sets the stage for when it's going to be a moth in flight. So some moth species overwinter as adults. They're the ones like winter moth, which out on the coast you start having larvae right from the get-go before buds even break, because that species is up and about and doing its thing. Where with codling moth, it isn't going to be till after bloom that you get larvae. And in the case of this particular pest, it has to go through pupation in the spring, and it isn't until bloom time that males and females are flying. So this, again, it's just knowing the species, setting the stage for timing. The male has to find the female. So one of the things they do in larger commercial orchards is something called mating disruption. Male finding female is actually a point of vulnerability. We males understand it. I know if they're not code there. And in mating disruption, these pheromones, about 400 to the acre, are put out that have the female scent. And so the males smell the female everywhere. And so mating doesn't occur. And if you get into smaller acreage, it gets a little more complicated because they can fly in from the borders, and you have to actually go into the woodlands. And you have to have a site where the air isn't always blown out regularly. So if you're near the ocean on the very top of a hill, that's not the right kind of site. Anyhow, that's available to larger growers. Female gets impregnated and now needs to lay her egg. And she's going to find fruit trees and also sense that an apple fruitlet is developing nearby. So those eggs are not being laid at bloom. She wants to actually know that a fruitlet has been pollinized and has the ability to sense that. Those eggs are laid on the surface of the fruitlet or on a leaf or a nearby twig. And those eggs are going to sit there for 10 to 14 days. And during those 10 to 14 days, there's a couple species of braconid wasps that can sense this pinhead-sized egg, find it, and put its egg in the egg. And that's going to take care of as many as 20% of those eggs. In California, they actually raise a parasitic wasp called trichogama. And trichogama are known to find as many as 60% of those eggs. So just the fact that that egg is sitting out there is a chance for nature to get in some dibs. That's nowhere near what we would call control, but it's 15-20%. That egg hatches within 24 hours. That larva is in the fruit. But within those 24 hours, something like a minute pirate bug might snag that little crawling larva, or a chickadee comes along and gets a few. So we can call that 5%. The larva is going to be in there eating the seed cavity for about 2 weeks. It's safe during that time, but then it's going to do one of two things. It's either going to emerge out of the side of the fruitlet and crawl its way back down the branch, heading towards the trunk, because it knows instinctively that it needs a place to hide, to pupate, and under the rough, curly bark of a mature apple tree is an ideal place to do that. Or, conversely, the fruitlet's going to drop to the ground, and then the larva comes out, and it's going to make its way across the ground. So during those two journeys, there are parasitic wasps that lay their eggs on top of the larva, which then go on to consume the larva. There are more birds finding those larvae. There are spiders in the tree getting some of those larvae. There are ants and ground beeters getting the larvae going across the ground back towards the trunk to pupate, and that's another 15-20%. The codling moth goes into pupation. This is where the nuthatch or the woodpecker comes along and finds a few. Or there are tachnid wasps that lay its eggs inside the pupal case, which then go on to eat the codling moth. And if you add all these numbers up, we're talking about 60-65% of the situation being checked just naturally by virtue of biodiversity that encourages and stewards all these other species. And when you start to do that kind of thing, then it's possible to use more gentler means of nudging the population if you still feel it's an issue. And here's another example of a great point of vulnerability. That notion that the caterpillar wants to get down the trunk to the scaly bark or across the ground to the scaly bark means that we can provide a setting for it to go into pupation. And this was first done in the 1860s, and it was done in such a way that they twisted braids of hay, and one braid would be tied right around the lower base of the branches, and another just a few inches above the soil. And then, in understanding its cycle, knowing that first eggs hatch about a week to 10 days after petal fall, that takes another 2 weeks plus before the larva's coming out of the fruit, that means that somewhere about the end of June, early July, if you took those hay braids off, you would find a lot of pupil of codling moth in pupation, and you could burn those hay braids. Today, we can use corrugated cardboard. I don't know what Josh is doing up there, but I know all the eyes are now up on Josh. Okay.
He's taking caterpillars.
Getting dinner. But corrugated cardboard, the same thing. Just take a piece of duct tape. But you have to know the right timing, and you burn it. And so if codling moth has been a big issue, here's a rather simple way if you're dealing with 6 trees. You know, I have 300 trees. That's not so simple to do. But it is on a home orchardist scale. But it's all based on knowing that life cycle, the habits of that insect, the needs of that insect, and where can we intercept it in a way that makes sense for us. So there's a lot of intelligent possibilities to start to knock back bug populations. So let's get into apple maggot fly. Apple maggot fly is something probably most of us have, probably all of us have. It's a fly about 1/8 of an inch long, and it has clear wings with the marking which looks like a W in black on the clear wing. And it has a little white dot in its forehead. And maggot flies start to emerge at some point in June. And the ones that come out in June are going to smell the ripening volatiles of the early summer apples. So in late June, early July, it's going for varieties like Lodi or Yellow Transparent or Red Astragan or Duchess, any of the varieties that ripen some point in August. And it doesn't all emerge at once. This is a fly that there's successive emergence periods. So some of them are waiting. And if it's a really dry year, more are waiting than not. So the ones that emerge in mid-July are going to go for the mid-season apples. And so now we're talking about the Gala, the Macintosh, whatever you think of harvesting in late September, early October. In late July, maggot flies are getting them if they're left unchecked. And if it's a really, really dry summer, there'll be maggot flies that emerge in mid-August, even late August, and they will go after the late winter keeping type apples. But usually we don't face that. They're usually going to get dissipated in June and July. So here's a fly that comes into the tree, and it's drawn to the ripening volatile odors of a developing apple. So the apples are only about half the size they're going to be. They're not that big yet, but that's when they're starting to develop those smells that bring the fly. The fly can only see like 3 feet. And so when it gets into a tree where it senses that smell, it's there, and it starts looking around thinking, which is the best place to raise my children? It's not unlike us. We're moving into a new neighborhood, and we might think about, do I want to have a Montessori school nearby, or a Waldorf school, or maybe a volatile odor being released. Red Delicious has put it down. By covering the surface with sticky, the flies land there. And this is not something I feel compelled to clean up and save for next year. In fact, you'll find that they keep their red color till Christmas, and you can leave them in your trees as a Christmas decoration. So Red Delicious actually does have a purpose. And just to carry through there, why am I picking on Red Delicious? When an apple is grown in large quantities by a lot of different people in a lot of different places, there are mutations that happen to that particular variety. And the odds are just increased when there's a lot being grown. So Red Delicious was actually originally named the Hawkeye, and it had a lot more green in it, and it wasn't so elongated. But over the course of time, bud mutations occurred. Sometimes it was a whole branch, usually as a result of how cold came on in the fall. And so some of the red delicious on a particular tree on one branch would be more red, or they'd be more elongated. And all of this led to an apple being chosen to be grafted as the new representative of this variety. And we've gone through about 30 plus mutations with red delicious, which is now an apple that you can take and you can throw it across the cafeteria and bounce it off the wall and not tell that it has a bruise. And that's what's been chosen, rather than choosing better flavor, more resistance to disease. It's been an emphasis on the packaging, what it looks like. And so that's why I pick on red delicious.
It's still delicious. It might be delicious, you know?
Yeah, it might be.
Marketing.
It could be, but if you pick it, if you get like the ripe day.
Right.
My daughter loves them, but only for about a day after we buy them. And then they go and turn to mush.
I have
I've
one
never
red
had a good
delicious, and it seems like an old tree from UNH studies or something. And keeps a long time, but it's not much for taste.
But the original actually had a nice flavor. So, I mean, if you like that kind of apple, it's useful to know.